So Ahkello Witherspoon's gone, and now it gives the sense that maybe Omar Khan's got something cooking as the Steelers GM. We'll talk about that, the impact of the secondary, and what I think could be coming down the pipeline for your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it on YouTube. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. So let's get down to the basics here. The Steelers officially released Ahkello Witherspoon, which means he comes off the books. Approximately $4 million also comes free in the salary cap to getting the Steelers in an interesting position there. Now we get to talk a little bit of what is the plan behind this, because going into what we thought was going to be OTAs, which are starting next Tuesday, in fact. So we're less than a week away from OTAs and then mini camps getting started. But the idea that I thought the Steelers had in their mind was, hey, at cornerback, you got veteran-wise, you got Patrick Peterson, Levi Wallace, Ahkello Witherspoon, James Pierre, and then you got newcomer Chandon Sullivan you signed in free agency, and then you got your two rookies in Joey Porter Jr. and Corey Trice. So thinking they're like, okay, if we're thinking of keeping 5 or maybe 6 cornerbacks, one slot, and then 5 guys that can play outside with 1 or 2 guys that can maybe play inside as well, you got Patrick Peterson, obviously, Joey Porter Jr., obviously, and then you can figure it out between if Chandon Sullivan is your slot, then you probably look right to Levi Wallace and Ahkello Witherspoon, and then probably find a way to keep Corey Trice on the roster because you like his frame and his measurables as a rookie. So then let's see again. We're talking 3 guys there, because 1 in the slot, 2 on the outside, then your 2 backups on the outside. That's 5 already, and then you could throw in Corey Trice. But then there's room for James Pierre, who's been a very good special teamer and a decent backup at the cornerback room. And so then that's where you start pushing up against the numbers. And it kind of makes sense to let go of Ahkello Witherspoon if you don't think he's got it. Now, he's also been hurt, and that's also been a problem. And he also did not have a good 2022 season. He got beat several times last year, and that was a problem. Levi Wallace kind of emerged and took over that role. And if you go back and look at their contract numbers for the Steelers were very similar. They had the same guaranteed kind of money that was going to stick with them. They had the same the same cap savings that they'd make if they were let go from the Steelers. So to me, that was more about they were going to see which of those veterans they wanted to keep around, and whoever was the better one, they'd keep. And last year, Levi Wallace was clearly the better one, so they kept him around. And now you're in a position where you have at least Levi Wallace and Patrick Peterson, 2 veterans that you assume can just plug and play at the starter role. If Joey Porter Jr. needs some time to develop, but you're hoping Joey Porter Jr. develops into a starter, and then you see what happens with a Corey Trice, and then you're looking at your cornerback position and saying, okay, James Pierre, he's at least reliable to be a competitive guy who could come in and give you some important snaps, and maybe you can work him into the slot a little bit and see how he plays there. But he's been a guy who's he's hung around for years because he's paid attention to the details. So to me, what this signifies is I think the Steelers may feel comfortable with this cornerback room. And what I think this really sets up is Omar Khan is looking to buttress the defense with maybe some other moves coming in free agency in the coming weeks here, and maybe even in the coming days. Now, we'll get to more about whether or not it should be an inside off-ball linebacker or an edge rusher type of situation to help it, or even both in that situation. Kwon Alexander is still a free agent. He hasn't signed with the Steelers after he left, though that doesn't necessarily mean he's not coming, because that could be just a physical thing where he came in, got tested. They wanted to see results, and then they wanted to weigh some things, and they probably needed to make some contact with him again. Again, we'll get to those two positions and which should be the priority here for the Steelers. But again, going back to the secondary, I think it speaks to the confidence that they have in some of the guys that they've got on their roster for that, even if Joey Porter Jr. takes some time to develop into having a consistent starting role, Levi Wallace can live out there. You signed Patrick Peterson to live out there. And James Pierre can come in and give you help in a pinch. And then between Joey Porter Jr. and Corey Trice, you got two rookies who you think that you can work to develop out there. That's a pretty good, situation to have. You got some veterans who know your system, some new guys that are young and they're both 6'3" with long arms who can play physical, the type of cornerback play that you want on your team. I think a lot of this makes sense. And Ahkello Witherspoon could have been another veteran in the room, and maybe he would have pushed off, a James Pierre or someone like that off the roster. But again, he gets you back $4 million, and you have to think Omar Khan, he's been pretty, I wouldn't say aggressive, but he's been pretty solid as far as finding value for different salary cap spaces and draft picks for the Steelers to fit holes on the roster and make it so at least on paper going into practices and camp this year, the Steelers have a nice balanced group of players. There's again, we can look at inside linebacker and say, okay, yeah, maybe that's a weakness for sure, but they've at least invested in that position, bringing in two veterans to help out there so that it can potentially at least hold down the kind of play that they had last year and keep that up at least, and maybe even take a step forward slightly and just be a group that doesn't get the defense beat. Meanwhile, they've made sure that the defensive line both has old and young players that they're expecting really good play out of. They've got edge rushers they're really excited about at the starting position. They drafted another edge rusher. They've got safeties they're really happy and excited about. And again, we talk about the corner situation. Then on offense, you got an offensive line you're excited to see coalesce. Kenny Pickett in his second year, Najee Harris and Pat Frymuth in their third years. And then George Pickens, Deontay Johnson, Calvin Austin, Allen Robinson. Again, you look across the board, there's a lot of answers on this roster to that they could be like, hey, there's all these different guys that could be really important filling spots. So I think letting go of Ahkello Witherspoon, he had some good moments in 2021 in that second half of the season, but I think ultimately he did what he was going to come to Pittsburgh to do, which was come in, give you a couple fill-in spots, see if he could develop into a consistent corner. He didn't. They move on. He moves on. And now the question is, what do you do with the money that was freed up by Ahkello Witherspoon leaving? We'll talk about that and what I think the Steelers could be lining up in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Before we go anywhere else, I want to talk to you guys about one of our great sponsors, Built Bar, because this episode is sponsored by Built Bar. And don't forget, Built Bar is the best protein bar in America. It's the best, not just because it tastes great, but it's also great for you. Built Bar is a protein bar that's covered in 100% real chocolate and comes in so many different flavors, and somehow it gets rid of all the fat and all the calories that come with when you taste tasty treats that you normally eat throughout the day. They come, and again, Built Bars come in so many different flavors. If you like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, double chocolate brownie, cookies and cream, they've got flavors for you. And again, those flavors come inside a protein bar that is covered in 100% real chocolate to give you that real taste of chocolate, that real snacky feel. But here's the thing, with all those flavors and all that chocolate, you're still only getting about 130 calories, only getting 4 grams of sugar, and somehow they're fitting 17 grams of protein in. So you're getting all the gains that you need in your protein, but also none of the junk in the massive calories or the massive sugar boost that you would be getting if you're trying regular snacks. So go get some Built Bars right now, and you can do so not just by going to built.com, their website, but also by going to your local Walmart and Sam's Club. Go to your local Walmart and Sam's Club today. If you go to Walmart, you go to the pharmacy section and grab 4 bar boxes of Built Bars with flavors like cookies and cream, double chocolate, and coconut puffs. You can also go to Sam's Club and buy 13 bar boxes of Built Bars with flavors like brownie batter and churro. Trust me, when you try Built Bars, you'll be thanking me later, because Built Bars are the best protein bars in America, and they're great for you too. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We do have some questions we will get to on the show today, so don't worry about that there. If you ever want to call in for a question, it's 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute, and we'll try to get you on the show. Also, if you donate to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation campaign that we have running on this show all throughout the summer and even a little bit into the fall, you can guarantee that your question will be answered on air. We get a ton of questions, and there's some of them I just don't have time to get to because we have so many questions, but we try to get to them as we can on this show. So go, if you want to donate to that campaign, or even if you just want to help us out with anything that you can, go to the campaign website right now. It's on your screen if you're watching on YouTube. It's also a link in the description of both the podcast. If you're listening to it in an audio format, go to the description of the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, go to the description of that. You can click on the link there, donate whatever money that you can. It would be a big help to those as we fight a terrible disease in cystic fibrosis that impacts tens of thousands of Americans every year. So thanks again to everyone who's helping with that campaign. But let's get back to the discussion at hand, and that's what the Steelers need to do with the opportunity they have here. Now, there's a few different ways that this could be looked at. There's always people who differ in their measurements of numbers, and who's what cap space you have left over if you're the Steelers. If you go to Spot Rack right now, with the removal of Ahkello Witherspoon, they have about $10.2 million in cap space. If you go to overthecap.com right now, they have about $11.1 million in cap space. So roughly $11 million in cap space there. Now, we also know in traditional times with Kevin Colbert over the 20 plus years that he was GM, the Steelers wanted to keep about $10 million ish, maybe $8 to $10 million in case they needed to make a splash free agent signing because of an emergency injury that puts them in a tough situation. They need like rainy day spending, if you will. And they still haven't signed all of their rookies. So there's still things that need to be finalized there with these contracts and everything. But I do think their situation that they're in right now, they still have chances. Other guys that they can cut if they need to, maybe another contract or two they could restructure if they really wanted to. They have the opportunity still to fill out this roster right now. And I believe with the releasing of Ahkello Witherspoon, that should give them about 3 roster spots left, unless I missed a signing of late that they can bring in as far as their 90-man roster that they can bring into OTAs. And that's going to be really interesting to see. Who do they try to fill it with? Now, they could go get guys like Alonzo Graham, who was an HBCU grad at Morgan State, who came to rookie camp and is just more of an undrafted free agent. They're giving, more chances to show them what he can do. Or they could go get some veterans in the NFL who are still in the free agency pool and see, hey, what do you have for us? How can you help us out and be good depth for the Steelers? And I think that's what they're looking for right now. Now, as I said before, earlier in the week, they brought in Kwon Alexander on Monday, linebacker, who most recently with the Jets. He's been with the Bucs and the Niners as well. He'll be 29 years old at the start of the season. Kwon Alexander left Pittsburgh without a contract. That doesn't mean he's definitely not coming, because they could be looking over a physical. Kwon Alexander's had a lot of injuries in his career. There could be a lot of things going on there. But him leaving still begs the question, what's the more important position the Steelers need right now? And it could be, do they need a backup linebacker who's going to play an off-ball, or they need a backup edge rusher? Because to me, those are the two things I'd be looking at if I'm Omar Khan. Everyone's excited about TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith maybe getting a full healthy year together for them to just terrorize backfields as being maybe the best 1-2 punch at edge rusher in the NFL this year. But behind them, who do you got? You got Nick Herbig, who you drafted and he's going in the 4th round as a rookie, and maybe he comes along. You got Quincy Roche, who you got back off of waivers after he left your team because you left him on the practice squad recently. But you don't have that proven guy who could come off the bench and give you some important snaps that give TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith a breather during important games. And we know that that's vital. You want to keep those guys fresh. You want to keep your whole defense fresh. That has been, speaking of vital, that's a big part of Andy Weidel's plan that he set up for the Eagles. He would, as far as how they would build things over there with Howie Roseman, they wanted a rotation of fresh defensive linemen all throughout the game because they wanted to bring pressure. They wanted to be more physical. They wanted to be a team that could bring the pressure, bring the intensity to you all 4 quarters long and have guys not being tired, your key players not being tired in the fourth quarter. And let's just face it, if you just play guys through the entire game, they're going to get tired. They're going to need breathers. And this is why, again, I think it would behoove them to get, a backup edge rusher. But is that more important than finding depth at linebacker right now? Because you look at a Landon Roberts and Cole Holcomb, and you're like, okay, 2 decent run-stuffing linebackers who could kind of fill that void for now. Neither of them are coverage guys. But then behind them is Mark Robinson, who, as much as people liked him as a 7th-round pick last year, he's got a ways to grow. And then, on top of that, maybe you're saying Keanu Neal will come down as a dime backer, as a, an extra safety who operates as a dime backer, and he helps there sometimes. But still, I think these are both legitimate needs. And I think the question now becomes for Omar Khan, does he need to narrow it down to just getting one? Or can he find a way to get answers for both here in free agency right now? And remember, free agency, the main signings have all happened, but there's still big names out there. If you're looking at edge rusher, some of the top names include Leonard Floyd, Yannick Ngakoue, guys like that who are playing there. But the Steelers have to avoid the same pitfall they fell into with Melvin Ingram when they signed him just a little bit ago. When he came in, and Melvin Ingram had complaints because he was not getting starts over Alex Highsmith, who I think that he said in camp that he was fine if Alex Highsmith won the job. But then when Alex Highsmith did, he wanted out, and the Steelers had to trade him away and only got like a very low pick for him. And that was a veteran that they were hoping to have around so that, whenever TJ Watt needed a blow, whenever Alex Highsmith needed a blow, they had a guy that they could just rely on to go out there and play. And so that's one of the common battles that you face when you're talking to veteran free agents. They could say all the right things in the meeting, but how will they feel when they're being passed up on for snaps by younger players that they may feel that they're better than? And so that's why, signing a guy like a Leonard Floyd, like an Yannick Ngakoue, those could prove challenging. But there's also other guys out there that could fit that model. There's Trey Flowers, who was just with the Dolphins. There's Kyle Van Noy, who was with the Chargers, formerly with the Patriots. Those guys are all edge guys. There's also bigger names like Justin Houston, who's still out there. And Justin Houston's a guy that's been producing, with 1-year contracts for some time in the NFL. I think he's averaging 11 sacks a year the last 2 years alone. So there's guys like him, Robert Quinn, that could play edge. But then there's also linebacker. And I think that, again, when you look at edge rushers, outside linebackers, those type of guys, they're going to be more expensive usually because there's more of a market to get 1-year pass rushers who come in, supplement until you find the next guy in the draft. And it's just a more attractive spot, in my opinion, and it's going to attract more money. Something that we talked about with Joe Marino, the draft expert we had on from Locked On NFL Scouting on the Wednesday episode. He mentioned how the difference was for tight end and wide receiver as a pay grade when it came to, paying the top tier at each position, and how, some teams are starting to move to paying their tight ends instead of paying their wide receivers because tight ends is just less expensive. And maybe that's what the Steelers need to do with Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington some way down the line. But again, talking about that is just about, hey, there's different markets for things. Edge rusher is a much more lucrative market for players trying to make their money than off-ball linebackers. Off-ball linebackers are kind of becoming like the running back of the offense, where people say you don't draft one in the first round. That's why people were frowning at the Lions for picking Jack Campbell at 18th overall. People don't want that to happen as much nowadays. And they think that off-ball linebackers are the least valuable because they're the least likely to contribute with turnovers because they're important. They bring that. But if you have an edge rusher who's getting pressure or an interior pass rusher who's getting pressure, those guys are going to be more disruptive than necessarily most of your off-ball linebackers. And I think that that's just part of what it is. So then you have to ask yourself, if you're Omar Khan, what do you prioritize? Because if you prioritize this defense and you want to fill out the depth chart here and you could find a way to get both, great. But I think you really need to make sure that if you're getting a third guy who's coming in off the edge, they're a guy that knows their role, talented, can help stuff the run, and occasionally get after the quarterback as well. And that's expensive. Those type of guys. They make money. There's a circuit of players who just make 1-year deals, get paid, move on to the next town, make another 1-year deal, get paid, move on to the next town. That's been Justin Houston for a little bit now. So if I'm the Steelers, I look at edge rusher and seeing what kind of prices I can get. But off-ball linebacker, you might be able to get some of those guys, including Kwon Alexander, for very reasonable prices. Another name I'll throw out there is Rashaan Evans, a guy who they looked at in the draft years ago when they were trying to sign when they were trying to draft a Ryan Shazier replacement at off-ball linebacker. But Rashaan Evans, 27 years old, he's a guy that you could look at there. There's other guys like Jalen Smith, but I think his injury history is just a little too much for my blood. Zach Cunningham, maybe. But to me, the Steelers, they still need that third presence as an off-ball linebacker. But honestly, for me, bigger importance is finding another edge rusher who can create pressure and stuff the run occasionally so that TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith can both get their breathers, come back in and be fresh, and the Steelers don't compromise too much of their defense by putting in a liability. They don't have to be superstars. They just got to be solid. And so the question will be, how much will it take to get solid at those players? It's much cheaper to get a solid off-ball linebacker than it is to get a solid edge rusher. We'll see what Omar Khan does and what other tricks he has up his sleeve as the time continues until the Steelers start OTAs and even after that maybe. But before we do any of that, I want to answer some of your calls here on the show. We'll do that in the third segment of the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, and we're going to continue the show here with some call-ins that we have here. Now, these are some calls that have been sitting here, and I've been trying to work them in. We've had some different calls here and there, so I'm going to work in 3 calls this segment and get you in here. Remember, you can call in at 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We'll try to get you in on the show. Our first question comes from our friend Carlos out in Texas, who asked a question about Matt Canada. We've had a few of those, but I wanted to hear Carlos out here. Here's his question.
Hey, Chris, this is Carlos from Texas. I wanted to see if I could get your opinion on whether you think that Matt Canada will hold this offense back. I know we've got a few weapons, but there's still some question marks there for our offensive coordinator. Just wanted to get your opinion on that. And also, who is your favorite Steeler of all time? Curious.
Thank you, callers, for your questions. I think there's a little bit of a tail end question there, and I'll get you my favorite Steeler of all time in a minute. But to answer your question, I do think Matt Canada could hold the Steelers offense back. We've talked about that a bit on the show because I do think that Matt Canada hasn't put it together yet. But I also think that the things he's been accused of holding them back from haven't been all the way accurate. There's times where I disagree with, where the Steelers tried to go in a certain situation, but there's also been plenty of times when I sit back and I watch the All-22 or when I'm just sitting in the press box at a Steelers game and I'm seeing it live and people saying, oh man, that was a dumb play call. And I'm like, no, Deontay Johnson was wide open over here, or Pat Freiermuth was wide open over here. The ball needs to get there. And part of that, though, still revolves around the offensive coordinator's job is also to help coordinate the offense so that the quarterback understands where to go with the football. But here's the thing. When you're dealing with a rookie, it's hard to do that. It's very hard for the rookie to get their feet under themselves. That's why I think there's so much excitement around Kenny Pickett. Yes, his numbers weren't great last year when you looked at them on a spreadsheet, but the fact that he responded the way he did to his early mistakes is very encouraging that he will continue to grow. And then the things that Matt Canada has drawn up that were open, when you go back and look at some of the film in the All-22, maybe some more of those things will start to be targeted by Kenny Pickett, and that will help open up the offense. And with the coalescing of the offensive line that we saw last year and the boost we're seeing this year of Broderick Jones and Isaac Seumalo to the offensive line, maybe we see an offensive line that's more dominant and gives them more tools to work with the run game and pass protection. All of those things play a factor there. But yes, Matt Canada could be what holds up the Steelers. We just got to see if that's actually the case and what he does with I think what is going to be the most talented offense that he's had as offensive coordinator in his time with the Steelers. And to answer your second question, I go back between two guys because I go back to my youth. I'm only 34 years old. So I go between Hines Ward, Ben Roethlisberger is I think maybe one of the best. But as far as my favorite Jerome Bettis, and that's more of a personal thing, and Troy Polamalu. I think Troy Polamalu is my top guy. Jerome Bettis holds an important place in my heart. Now I'll share this out here if y'all want some personal stuff here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Years ago, it was the winter of 2017. The Steelers were making their way to the AFC Championship game that year, and my grandmother was one of the most diehard Steelers fans ever, and she wasn't doing well. We knew she was running out of time, and she was in hospice care, and I wasn't sure if this was going to be her last Christmas. And big thanks to our friends at Channel 11 and Albie Oxenrider. Albie and Channel 11 set it up so that that Jerome Bettis, who does a show with Channel 11, signed a whole bunch of gear and even filmed a personalized message to my grandmother to just that we played for her on Christmas when we went to go visit her. And he just wished her well, said, "We need you back out there, Miss Carrie. We love you. We know that you're rooting for us all the time, so we're rooting for you." And that was the last time I ever saw my grandma really kick her feet up and laugh, because she passed away just about like a week or two later. It meant the world to me from Jerome Bettis. So Jerome gets a personal boost as far as favorite Steelers there in my book, because my grandmother had his picture all over her walls. And she had several Jerome Bettis pictures in her apartment. So thank you, Jerome Bettis, for that moment that you gave to my family. So that's that. But Troy Polamalu, if we're talking about like on the field efforts, that guy's the best safety I've seen play live. Anyways, let's get some more of your questions here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Here's Dylan from Toronto. We got an international one here, baby. Granted, it is Canada, but it's still international. Here's Dylan with the question.
Hey, Chris. It's a first-time caller here. My name's Dylan. I'm from Toronto. Not many Pittsburgh fans out here. Well, there's a few. But if Kenny can be above average, I think the run game is more than enough to carry that offense, and that will be our identity, as is very clear from this whole entire offseason. Am I crazy for thinking of this team as a legitimate potential Super Bowl contender? Like, I think there's only 8 teams in the NFL you can say that for: Cowboys, Bills, Bengals, Chiefs, whatever. I think we're one of them. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Dylan, for your question. I won't say you're crazy if by asking the question, are the Steelers Super Bowl contenders? I think you're maybe a little overeager. That's where I would put it. I think the Steelers are contenders this year. I think that they are playoff contenders. I think they're a team that can win a playoff game or two this year. I don't think that they're Super Bowl contenders yet, and here's why. I think in a crunch game against the Chiefs, they would need a lot to go their way in a playoff game because they'd most likely be on the road. I think that they could take most teams in the NFL right now, as far as if you met on neutral ground, you could battle out with those guys. I think that they'll split with the Bengals. I think that they'll at least split with the Ravens. I think that they could play with the Jets with Aaron Rodgers. I think that this year they're going to be able to play with the Bills if they were to meet at some point in the postseason. They don't meet in the regular season for the first time in like 5 years. That's crazy. But I look at the AFC, and we've talked about this before. I don't think the AFC is this big, bad boogeyman that people are making it out to be because there's all these big names at quarterback. I think the Steelers are in a position where they can be competitive. They can be physical if the offensive line's what they think. And then, like you said, if Kenny Pickett is above average and the Steelers offense reaches that physicality that we're talking about, the defense is what the defense is supposed to be, and TJ Watt's not hurt for a long period of time, I think the Steelers could be a dangerous team. But again, I'm not sure. I'm not willing to put them a Super Bowl team just yet because I think that it's going to take some time to get there. But I think that for some people who think that the Steelers, they're just not going to win a Super Bowl anytime soon, I think that after this season, people will look at them a lot more seriously as Super Bowl contenders as they continue to build around Kenny Pickett and build more parts of this roster out. All right, we got one more question here, and this question is a bit outside of the box thinking as far as how the Steelers could address things. And you'll get what I mean when you hear this question. And at first I was like, this is kind of crazy. But let's hear this guy out because I've made a similar call in the past on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Here's Corey from Kentucky asking the question.
Hey, what's up, Mr. Carter? Big fan of the show. Listened for a long time. My name is Corey, and I'm calling from Glasgow, Kentucky. The local team around here is the Tennessee Titans, because Nashville's not too far from me, so I hear a lot of news coming from the Titans organization, and they're talking about cutting potentially Kevin Byard. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were. What will be the likelihood that Mr. Byard could don the black and gold, and what would that look like with him back there with Minkah Fitzpatrick? Hope you have an awesome day. Like I said, big fan. Thanks a lot, man. See you.
Thank you very much for Corey, and thank you to everyone who called in at 412-223-6644 with your questions for the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let me say this. I get where Corey's coming from, because some people probably listened to this and said, what the heck, Chris? Why are you talking about Kevin Byard? He signed up with the Titans. They wouldn't let him go. Let me explain why I think where Corey's coming from. Last year, I said the same thing about Myles Jack when I was looking at contracts, and I just said, Jaguars, really expensive player, need to rebuild, probably not worth that money that they're paying him. They're probably going to let him go. And linebackers in need for the Steelers, this would just make a lot of sense. And lo and behold, it worked. Now, it didn't work out for the Steelers in the long run because Myles Jack is back out as a free agent. But maybe he's a guy that they'll look at again if they don't get anybody else at linebacker. Who knows? But when it comes to Kevin Byard, would the same thing happen here? Now, I will say this. Kevin Byard, big cap hit. He's the second most expensive player on the Titans roster as far as cap numbers for this year, only behind Ryan Tannehill. He's the most expensive skill player out there that they have as far as cap numbers. He's a $19.6 million cap hit this year for the Titans. And they still can afford it. They're $10 million under the cap, so that they're totally fine. And they have him signed through the end of 2024, so they have him for 2 more seasons on the books right now, and he's 30 years old. So, maybe if you wanted to see like, okay, maybe there's something there, but I'll say a few things why I don't think this would happen, Corey. One, they'd only save about $5.9 million if they moved him, unless the Steelers were to take on more of that salary cap number. And I don't think that the Steelers want to take on that big of a salary cap number. I do think that Kevin Byard would be a very interesting pairing with Minkah Fitzpatrick, and would allow DeMonte KZ to maybe play more in the box, play more slot, and then also Keanu Neal be more of a strictly a dime linebacker. And then you could look at some interesting flexibility in the Steelers defense. I just don't think that that's going to happen with the signings they've made at safety at all there. I also think this too, because I actually reached out, when I got this question, I was like, let me reach out, because we have our friend Tyler, who does the Locked On Titans podcast. And he was like, Chris, he's like, I heard the same rumblings. I don't see it. And from what I understand, the organization, the Titans, that is in a position where they need to prove that they are committed to finding a way to win, or at least trying to win. And if they traded away Kevin Byard for anything less than like a second-round pick, which I don't think the Steelers would give up for a 30-year-old safety. If they did anything like that, there would be problems in Tennessee. So no, I don't think Kevin Byard would be the move there. But I do think there could be a cut and sign that could happen sometime this offseason. Remember, that's how the Steelers got Joe Hayden. And maybe we're talking about all the things that the Steelers could do now, and Omar Khan, and you bring Kwon Alexander and all these other things here. Maybe the Steelers are holding out for, what if that rainy day happens for some team and they need to unload somebody around or before training camp, and then all of a sudden the Steelers find their guy, and it's just a guy that's sitting there, and they're like, hey, perfect fit, let's bring you in here. And who knows? Maybe Corey's right. Maybe it is Kevin Byard. I don't think it will be by a long shot there. But the idea that someone can cut and then the Steelers make a sign move that we aren't anticipating, that is what I think is going to be important to see, because I do think something like that could be coming around the corner. And if it does, I think that Omar Khan would make the moves necessary, not necessarily and financially, the Steelers could afford if it's the right guy. They've been aggressive so far in filling the holes that they have on their roster. I don't see why they would stop being aggressive there. Granted, again, just not about Kevin Byard, but maybe for some of those positions we were talking about edge rusher, and off-ball linebacker. That being said, this has been a great show. Thanks so much for everyone for tuning in to the Locked On Steelers podcast. As always, you can find us on all our podcasting apps, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, so many different apps out there. If you have a favorite podcasting app, most likely listening to us on it. You can also check us out on YouTube. Check out our YouTube page. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button on our YouTube channel. When you hit the like button, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes. And catching up with all the things that we're trying to do here. If you want to help out the podcast even further, please go on Apple Podcasts, look up the ratings. We leave us a 5-star rating with a positive comment. You do both at the same time, and you'll get a special shout out at the end of the show. We appreciate everyone who does this for us because it helps get the word about all the things that we're doing here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. And if you want to help us with our effort to raise money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, please use the QR code that's on your screen if you're watching on YouTube, or use the link that's attached to this podcast on either your podcasting app or on YouTube. There's a link in the description that will take you right to my donation page to donate there to help out in this important cause that we're fighting for, to raise money to help find a cure for a disease that impacts tens of thousands of Americans every day. Thanks again for everyone checking us out. We're back tomorrow with more in your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.